Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 95 called The Mad Emperor. So since the last episode, which seems quite a while ago now, I hope you've had a good summer or winter depending where you live. I've been preparing the fourth book in my series on the Fall of the Roman Empire, which will be called Justinian's Empire, and covers the same ground as the last 20 or so episodes. And it should be out later this year, and I'll keep you updated on the timing. But now we're moving on to the next, and I think the final phase of the fall of the Roman Empire, when, in the early 7th century, there was a storm of warfare and destruction on an unprecedented scale, first between Rome and Persia, and then between the Arabs and pretty much everyone else, when a seismic change happened in Western Eurasia. The Sasanian Persian Empire disappeared forever. The Romans lost most of their Eastern Empire, which shrank to being little more than the territories on either side of Constantinople, i.e. Anatolia and Greece, and called Byzantium by most historians. And the new superpower that arose was, of course, the first Islamic Caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate, stepping into the shoes of its Roman and Persian predecessors, adopting and adapting much of these ancient civilizations, but also creating its own culture, political system and identity. It was, I think, one of those truly momentous points in history, much more so than when the barbarians conquered the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. And it was when the ancient world ended, when Islam began its ascent, and when Roman civilization disappeared in most of Europe in a period we call the Dark Ages. And in the next few episodes, we'll look at how and why this happened. I think it's one of the most important and also least understood bits of history, and we'll try to find answers to questions that have long baffled historians, like what really drove the rise of Islam and the collapse of both Rome and Persia. And as always, I'll try to look at these subjects objectively using the latest developments in research, especially archaeology and climate history, where I think a new and exciting interpretation of what really happened nearly 1500 years ago is starting to emerge. But before we get to that, let's return to our narrative and pick up our story where we left off in the last episode with Justinian's death on a cold night, the 14th of November 565, at the age of 83. When he heard the news, his nephew Justin rushed to the palace. He'd been waiting for this moment for months, if not years, and now he seized it with consummate political skill. His allies were lined up: the Patriarch of Constantinople, the palace guards, his senatorial supporters. They all joined in proclaiming him emperor. Next stop was the Hippodrome, where the mob could make or break emperors. They gave him the thumbs up. No one wanted trouble. Thus began the extraordinary and often overlooked story of Justin II, who history, I think, has been unkind to since he succumbed to some sort of mental illness in the second half of his reign before he could achieve what he was really aiming to do. So, who was he? Well, the first point is he was very much part of the Justinianic dynasty. He was the son of Justinian's sister Vigilantia and Justinian's adopted son, since he and Theodora had no children. His wife, Sophia, was Theodora's niece, making the two of them the closest that could be achieved to a dynastic succession. But the second most striking thing about him was that although he was part of the Justinianic dynasty, he denounced Justinian and reversed his most important policies. The poet and chronicler Corippus tells us he was scathing about the dead emperor once the required period of mourning was over. He told the senators in no uncertain terms that he was inheriting a poisoned chalice. Quote, "Many things were too much neglected while my father, i.e. Justinian, was still alive, and as a result, the exhausted treasury contracted many debts. End quote. He added that the major casualty of the depleted treasury was the army. Quote, for lack of necessities, the army has reached the point of collapse, with the result that the state is suffering from innumerable attacks and incursions by barbarians. End quote. So, in pretty much every sphere, Justin undid Justinian's policies. He immediately repaid the state's creditors, although where he got the money to do this from is unclear. He was on the side of the landed aristocracy, who Justinian had opposed, and he made concessions to them, for example, writing off tax arrears and allowing them to appoint town governors without paying the state for the privilege, as had been done in the past. By doing this, he made himself more popular than Justinian had been. He championed the old Roman values, which Justinian had partially rejected, by taking on, for example, the office of consul when he was made emperor, a historically anachronistic title, but one which was popular and which Justinian had abandoned. He placed the name Roma on his coins to emphasize his Roman heritage. But by far the most important change lay with foreign policy. Justinian's policy of paying tribute to the Persians and Avars was widely disliked. In the last episode, I suggested it was a major mistake on Justinian's part, since it made the Roman Empire subservient to its enemies, which wasn't a sustainable policy. Justinian had been a pragmatist who found it easier to pay off his enemies in the short term rather than invest in the army for the longer-term defence of the frontiers. Within just 7 days of his accession, Justin repudiated this policy by refusing to pay the Avars. On the 20th of November 565, an Avar embassy arrived in Constantinople to take the annual tribute Justinian had agreed with them. We don't know the precise amount, but we can assume it was a large payment. The poet Corippus has left us with an amusing description in which the Avars were ushered into the emperor's presence and told in no uncertain terms there wouldn't be any further payments. It was a bold move, and in my opinion, and the opinion of most contemporaries, exactly the right one. But Justin needed to expand the army if he was going to talk tough with his enemies. And this was where he ran into trouble. We'll return to that later, since in the short term he did get lucky with the Avars, who had no direct border with the Romans, and seemed to have been more bemused by Justin's hostility than anything else. Meanwhile, they focused their attention on their next-door neighbours, the Franks, Gepids and Lombards. The Franks managed to stop their westward expansion, but the Lombards along the lower Danube, led by an ambitious king, Alboin, spotted an opportunity to ally with them against their bitter foe, the Gepids, and this would end up causing the Romans major problems. In 566, with the Avars as allies, the Lombard king Alboin defeated the Gepids and killed their king. He married the Gepid king's beautiful daughter Rosamund, and according to legend, forced her to drink from a cup made from her father's skull. As we'll soon hear, this didn't make for a happy marriage. Meanwhile, the Avars took the opportunity to seize most of the Gepid lands. Even Justin was able to take something from the collapse of Gepid power by seizing the fortress of Sirmium, where much of the Gepid treasure was stored. However, it was at this point things started to go wrong for the Romans. Alboin realised how Avar power was growing along the Danube basin, and seeing the Roman army was thinly spread in Italy, in 568 he set out with his entire people, including other Germans, such as a large contingent of Saxons, for Italy, in a repeat of what King Theodoric had done with the Ostrogoths. The result was pretty disastrous for Justin. The Roman army in Italy was too weak to resist the invading Lombards. Narses, Justinian's minister and general who defeated the Goths in the early 550s, was governor of Italy and couldn't stop the Lombard invasion. One rumour was that he'd fallen out with Justin because the Empress Sophia had mocked him for being a eunuch and almost invited the Lombards in. Quite why Justin never sent reinforcements or new commanders to Italy to stop the Lombards has never been fully explained. With limited Roman resistance, Alboin rapidly conquered northern Italy and made Milan his capital. Then he marched south and established duchies in Tuscany, Spoleto, and even Benevento south of Rome. But his rise to stardom was cut short in 572 when his Gepid wife Rosamund got her own back and murdered him before fleeing herself to Roman-held Ravenna with a large part of the Lombard treasure. With that, the Lombard advance stopped, and the Lombard kingdom began to fragment as a number of dukes established their own duchies in defiance of the central authority. Finally, Roman reinforcements arrived to strengthen the garrisons in Ravenna, Rome, and most of southern Italy and Sicily. But Justinian's conquest of Italy, which had only been held in its entirety for 15 years from 553 until 568, was never recovered, and Italy would never again be a valuable Roman province, either economically or strategically. One reason Justin took his eye off the ball in Italy was Persia. As with the Avars, he wanted to stop paying tribute to the Persians. Justinian had agreed a 50-year truce in 562 and had paid 2 instalments for the first 10 years of it, meaning that in 572 Justin had the opportunity to renege on the next payment. And that was what he did with enthusiasm, for 2 reasons. First, relations between Constantinople and Persia were strained because of a couple of regional conflicts. One was a disagreement in the kingdom of Yemen, which Persia had seized control of when the pro-Roman government had been ousted in a civil war. And the other was a conflict in the Persian-controlled part of Armenia, called Pers-Armenia, where the Christian population petitioned the emperor for protection against the Persians. But the second reason was by far the most important. In 568, Justin had received an embassy from the Turkish Khan Dizabul, who had formed a powerful empire on Persia's northeastern frontier. The Turks were the new kid on the block in the Asian steppelands. They'd moved west probably for the same reason which paleoclimatologists believe was responsible for the Avar migration. That was drought. However, they were the strongest of the nomadic tribes, capable of pushing the Avars west and also dominating the White Huns, the Persians' traditional foe. They were interested in controlling the silk trade, which brought them into direct conflict with the Persians. Although the Turks initially offered peace to the Persians, the old king Khosroes had a healthy dislike of all steppe nomads and poisoned their ambassadors. So the Turkish Khan Dizabul turned to the Romans as an ally against the Persians. He was keen for Justin to attack the Persians in the west while he did the same in the east, and strongly argued for him to break the peace in 572, which Justin was planning to do anyway. The result was a major war in the east. Initially, this went rather well for Justin. In 572, a capable general, Marcian, led a Roman army into Armenia, where, helped by the Armenian rebel Vardan, he defeated the Persian army of occupation and captured the major city of Devin, taking Roman forces the furthest east they'd been for centuries. He then turned south and in 573 defeated the Persians in front of Nisibis, the main Persian fortress in Mesopotamia, and laid siege to it. But after that, everything went wrong for the Romans. First of all, there was no Turkish attack in the east. Second, the Roman high command began to fight among themselves. The reasons are far from clear, because our sources are so lacking in detail, and all we can glean is that Marcion was dismissed from his post for some misdemeanour, which John, the Bishop of Ephesus, says was because he offended the leader of the pro-Roman Ghassanid Arabs, called Mondir. Mondir had demanded money from Justin, which he had no means of paying. So Justin sent 2 letters, one to Marcion, telling him to arrange for Mondir's assassination, the other to Mondir himself, promising him money in due course. Somehow the 2 letters were mixed up, and Mondir, on reading of his own intended assassination, broke off all relations with the Romans. John of Ephesus says Justin unfairly blamed the mix-up on Marcion and replaced him with another general, Acacius, even when Marcion was on the point of capturing Nisibis. He criticises Justin for foolishly trying to cover up his own mistakes and says the army mutinied since they supported Marcion. The result was chaos, and the demoralised Roman soldiers retreated from Nisibis. The Persians quickly took advantage of this disarray and invaded Syria. The Ghassanid Arabs wouldn't defend the frontier, and there was no Roman army to oppose the Persians, who raided right up to the walls of Antioch. They also sacked the city of Apamea and returned, allegedly, with 292,000 captives, clearly a huge exaggeration. From these, Khosroes was said to have selected 2,000 of the most beautiful girls captured from the Romans, all virgins, and sent them as a present to the Turkish Khan to win an alliance with him. The story went that these young women were so horrified at the prospect of being handed over to the Turks, they committed mass suicide by drowning in a great river. The Persian turnaround continued when the aged Khosroes took personal command of the Persian army and probably strengthened it with units which had been guarding the eastern frontier against the Turks. Why the Turks never launched their offensive in alliance with the Romans remains the most significant mystery in this entire war. But their non-appearance meant Khosroes could pursue the Roman army as it retreated from Nisibis. Khosroes advanced to Dara, a short distance from Nisibis, and the major Roman stronghold on the eastern front, built by the Emperor Anastasius about 70 years before, and laid siege to it, apparently using many of the Roman siege engines captured outside Nisibis. Dara had enormous walls which had always resisted the Persians. But not this time. After a 6-month siege, the city fell. It was a terrible blow to the Romans. The Persian war had turned from looking so promising to a catastrophe. According to contemporaries, on hearing the news, Justin lost his mind. He had fits when he would pretend to be an animal and bite his chamberlains. Bars had to be put on the palace windows to stop him from throwing himself to the ground, and he spent most of the day being pulled around the palace in a little wagon while he was played soothing music. The only way of bringing him to his senses was to announce the arrival of the king of the Ghassanid Arabs, when he would try to pull himself together. The political situation was saved by Justin's wife, the Empress Sophia. She was the niece, as I've mentioned, of the great Justinian's wife Theodora, and had inherited her toughness. Right from the beginning, she'd been instrumental in securing her husband's elevation to emperor, and now that he'd become deranged, she stepped into his shoes to manage the government. The first thing she did was to secure peace with Persia. Returning to Justinian's practice of paying tribute, she offered Khosroes 45,000 solidi for a 1-year truce in 574. Khosroes was impressed with her decisiveness, sent her his sympathies for her husband, and agreed to the truce. But Sophia, strong-willed as she was worried there would be some sort of usurpation if she tried to rule the empire alone. She couldn't marry again since Justin was still officially emperor and still her husband. So she decided to opt for the next best thing, which was to appoint someone as Caesar, effectively a deputy emperor. And the most suitable candidate she could find was Tiberius, a Thracian aristocrat and soldier, and one of Justin's most trusted lieutenants, who'd commanded the Thracian field army and even defeated an Avar warband that had crossed the Danube in 570. Justin still had moments of sanity, and he and his wife discussed and decided on the appointment. On the 7th of December, 574, he formally appointed Tiberius Caesar and adopted him as his son. He made a speech which astonished his audience with its humility and intelligence. He said his illness was punishment for his arrogance and beseeched Tiberius to, quote, "act to all men as you would act to yourself, remembering what you were before and what you are now. Be not arrogant, and you will not go wrong." End quote. It was Justin's last act as emperor, although he lived for another 4 years until 578, when Tiberius became the sole emperor. In the meantime, Tiberius and Sophia took the empire in a new direction, as we'll cover in the next episode. So what are we to make of Justin's reign? I think it's one of the most difficult to decipher in all of late Roman history. We have no Procopius to give us a reliable account of events. Instead, we're reliant on the poet Corippus and John, the Bishop of Ephesus. The latter is our only detailed source on Justin's madness and the disastrous Persian War. But his account sounds more like the stuff of Arthurian legend, with crazy stories of the 2,000 virgins and Justin's madness. And we must realise he was very biased against Justin, because Justin was a staunch Chalcedonian, whereas John was a Miaphysite. Oh no, I hear you saying, not these obscure religious disputes yet again. So what is a Miaphysite? Well, Miaphysites were different from Monophysites and Chalcedonians because they believed Jesus was fully divine and fully human in one nature, whereas Chalcedonians believed Jesus had two natures, divine and human, but in one person. I think the difference between the two beliefs is so marginal that it's bordering on the unintelligible. And as I've mentioned before, the real reason, in my opinion, for these theological disputes was political. Doctrine in the late Roman Empire was weaponized for political ends. And John of Ephesus was actually persecuted and imprisoned by Justin for being a Miaphysite. He may even have died in prison, and some of his writings may have been written in prison. So he had a real axe to grind against Justin and blamed the Roman defeat on him. But I think the real reason was the failure of the Turks to honour their alliance with Justin. We simply have no idea why they never attacked the Persians, but the likelihood is this meant Khosroes could switch troops from the Turkish front to launch his counteroffensive, which captured Dara. So Justin's reign turned into such a disaster, it drove him mad. And whether we think this was the fault of the Turks or not, I suggest one thing was clear. The Roman army was simply too weak to defend the extended frontiers Justinian had bequeathed to his successors. And as we'll discover, this cost of overextension would dominate the reigns of all of the last Roman emperors. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And the next episode will be in 3 weeks' time, on the 5th of October. I'm sorry it's so long, but I have some other commitments. But after that, I hope it will be more frequent. And if you like the podcast, please do recommend it to a friend. That would be fantastic. The podcast is entirely free, requires no subscription, and doesn't even have adverts. And of course, also do check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com. Link in the show notes to find maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.